All right, Kevin, back with you for another episode of the Million Dollar Relationships Podcast. And today I am here with Ari Meisel. Ari, welcome. So awesome to have you here today.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm so grateful for you having me on after having rescheduled with you so many times.
Well, I'll tell you, being a dad myself, I can totally relate, Ari. You're like, man, Kev, I got a new baby coming, and I don't know exactly when the due date is, but it was like right around the first time we had scheduled this,
Yeah,
sometimes there's other priorities over doing an interview.
that's
and
right.
But this interview and this conversation that we're having today, Ari, it's in perfect timing. So this, no worries at all. And so I want to start. I want to give a couple of shout outs because first shout out I want to give is to Joe Polish, because Joe originally connected you and I probably 7 or 8 years ago. And
Yeah,
then most recently, Sue Rice, after I did an interview with her for the podcast, she was like, Kevin, you absolutely need to interview Ari for your podcast. And so I want to give a shout out to those two because, Ari, this is the first time that you and I have had a conversation like this. We connected before via email when I was looking for some help with my business, but this is the first time you and I have actually had a face-to-face conversation. But
that's
yet,
right.
because we have these mutual friends, it's like it feels like you and I have been friends for years, and that is the value of and testament to relationships right there. And so yeah, I'm really grateful for those guys. And what I'd like to do is just kind of start off, Ari, by turning it over to you and give you the opportunity to share a little bit, set a little bit of context, and share, what you do, who you serve, what inspires you most about the work you do. And we'll start there so everybody gets an idea a little bit about who Ari is and what's Ari all about.
Sure. So my main focus is on business coaching, and that I always find that sort of like under summarizes what it is that I actually do. So the context is that several years ago I started a productivity system. I created a productivity system called Less Doing, and over the years I've developed into a methodology for businesses called the Replaceable Founder. And so what I do is I help entrepreneurs become more replaceable. That's what I do. Now the way that works is that I do business coaching. And that is one of the very many things that I do in my life. I'm also a voluntary EMT. I have 5 children. I'm a woodworker. I'm involved in all sorts of different things. And part of the reason I can do that is, as I mentioned, I teach productivity. So I help the overwhelmed become more effective, essentially, is what I focus on doing. And the way that I'm able to do that in a business context is that my coaching is done exclusively asynchronously using a tool called Voxer. So I don't have any live calls. Currently have about 24 one-on-one private coaching clients around the world, and I don't have a single call on my calendar ever. This is like the only synchronous meeting I have this entire week is with you right now.
Wow.
So the people that I serve, generally, they are founders, some executive, but mostly founders of companies that are generally doing between $1 and $10 million in revenue. I've worked with every range there is in every industry there is, but that seems to be kind of the sweet spot for me. It's an interesting inflection point in people's growth. And at that point, they really need to be focusing on optimizing, automating, outsourcing everything that they're doing, creating systems that make them more replaceable as well as everyone in the business. And those are those people I work with. And what inspires me the most is that well, first of all, there's an expression that a lot of entrepreneurs sort of create companies to work out their own psychological issues, essentially. And so I feel that in the conversations that I get to have with the people that I work with, I learn so much more about myself as a business person, and I'm able to sort of pour that back into it. But there is people come to me because they want to automate a process, or they want to outsource something better, and 90% of the conversations end up being about psychology and emotions and the leadership communication styles that come along with that.
Wow, very interesting. So 1 to 10 million, And so what are, I'm just kidding, now you've got me thinking, because I'm curious, what are some of the biggest hurdles those entrepreneurs are up against in growing their businesses beyond that point?
Yes. So I know that Alex Sharfin.
Yes.
Right. So Alex had something, he created something called the Billionaire Code, which is this
Okay.
really interesting sort of, you've probably seen it, this metric of sort of the things that people deal with at different stages of their business in terms of revenue. And it is scarily accurate. And so the big shift that we see from the 300,000 a million to and then the million to 3 million. So those are the two brackets. The biggest shift there is you go from basically creating systems that replace what you do well to now hiring people to do what you do well, right?
Oh,
So I can't tell how many times I've seen somebody with $300,000 in revenue and they have 11 team members, and that's just insanity. Like, there are plenty of businesses, most businesses, I would argue nowadays, you could get to $1 million in revenue without having a single employee.
mhm.
It's easier and easier every day to do that. But once you head over that million mark, now you're starting to build a team, and building a team requires so many different facets of a personality that you probably didn't have before, because the person that grows a company from 100,000 to $1 million is not necessarily the person that's going to be the best at growing it from 1 million to 10. They could become that person, they can grow,
Mhm.
right? But it's not necessarily that's not necessarily their skill set. It just requires something very different. So the
Yeah.
1 million to 10 million people, they're really in that sort of flux where they're building a team, which requires sort of developing leadership systems, having a real company vision, and sort of ethics and things that you all follow, and having really good systems in place for communication, project management, automation. All those things need to be in place at that point, and they rarely are.
Yeah.
So most of the time with those people, we're kind of playing catch up. But that's that big hurdle, is that they've now hit this point where they're making a good amount of money because they're doing $1 million in revenue, which is great.
Mhm.
But they become victims of their own success in a
Yeah.
way,
Yeah.
and then they do what every entrepreneur is not supposed to do, which is wearing all the hats and pushing all the buttons. And it's that it's the I quit my 9 to 5 so that I didn't want to work I quit my job because I didn't want to work a 9 to 5, and now I work 24/7.
Yes, yes. Absolutely. Yeah, I have definitely experienced that in the past, for dang sure. And so okay, that was really good. And so I'm sure anybody who is in that spot right now, Ari, is going, okay, yeah, it's like this guy's reading my mind, you know. And so okay, so now that we've got a little bit of context set, I'm gonna shift gears, and I'm gonna reiterate the question for the benefit of the listeners. So Ari, have you ever been introduced to a person or persons who completely changed the course of your life or your business, so much so that much of what you have today would not be possible if not for this person or persons? And Ari, I'm just really excited to hear your story and your experience around this topic of relationships.
Yeah, I mean, that would be Joe Polish. There's no question. That is 100% Joe Polish. And
Okay.
it's there is definitely like my life before the first Genius Network that I ever attended, and then my life after.
Okay.
And it was a really fascinating experience meeting Joe, because so basically I wrote my first book, which was called it was called Less Doing More Living, and that was in, I want to say, 2014.
Okay.
And through a relationship that I had, I met David Bach, who wrote The Automatic Millionaire,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
several versions thereof. And he did the blurb for the front cover of the book. So it was the summer of 2014 or 15, I can't remember. I think 14. And we had 3 kids under the age of 3 at that point, which was
Wow.
yes. And I had not been like traveling for speaking or anything. I was very much like in the nascent stage of my business and my work. I had launched a podcast which had, like, not a big following. I had written this book. I was teaching classes every month or so in New York, and it was going. I mean, and I was coaching. I was doing one-on-one coaching with probably a dozen people at that point. So I get a FaceTime video call from an unknown number, which is like unusual, right? It's one thing to get
Sure.
a call, but not a FaceTime. So I'm like, all right, so I answer it. And he's like, hey, I'm Joe Polish. And it's like, okay, like I don't know who you are. And he's like, no, no, it's okay. It's like, I'm here with David Bach. And he shows me he's with David. And he's like, I finished your book and I loved it. And he shows me that he's got like post-it notes and highlights on my book. And I'm like, well, thanks a lot. He's like, you have to come speak at my event. It's called Genius Network, and it's next month in, I think it was like Laguna Beach or something. And I was like, like, and David Bach is there, and he's like, it's legit, Ari. Like, it's really. I'm like, okay, okay. So I asked my wife, like, can I do this? And it was like, okay, yeah, sure. And so, he puts me with Eunice, I believe, at the time. So
Yep. Yep.
we get everything booked. And because of the kids and everything, I wanted to sort of make this travel as minimally invasive as possible. So I took like the latest flight possible. I get into the hotel at like 1 a.m. Don't see anybody. I have a beautiful room. I'm gonna go to sleep. In the morning, I get up and I go to the event space. And on the way walking there, I meet Dan Sullivan. No idea who Dan Sullivan was at the time. Like, but he was very friendly. I was like, okay.
Mhm.
And I get in, and then it's like, oh, that's Dave Asprey. That's the Bulletproof Executive. Yeah, okay. And is that Damon John? I'm like, where the fuck am I? You know? And then, big deal at the time, I'm at the back of the room, and I look next to me, and it's Tim Ferriss, who was already a big deal at that point. And
Uh-huh.
I'm like,
Uh-huh.
holy shit! Like I start like fanboying at that point. And Tim, he was sort of friendly. We were like chatting. And then all of a sudden, Joe calls me up on stage and he introduces me as the next greatest productivity expert in the world, even better than Tim Ferriss. And Tim did not like that, and
Uh-huh.
sort of like gave me like a nod, like good luck with your talk. And I went up on stage and I gave a talk on a podcast process that I had automated. So I had this podcast process for my podcast that was taking me like upwards of 3 to 4 hours per episode. And when I built the process out, it was, 10 minutes essentially. And I had this whole graphic and everything. And at the time, I think it was really, really advanced in terms of automation for something that everybody, like half the room had a podcast at that point.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I got off stage, and all these people started coming up to me. Dean Jackson was there, and uh, oh God, what's his name? The big finance guy who's like he's got CEG worldwide.
Oh, John Bowen.
John Bowen, yes, and who's also wonderful. So John came up to me. All these people came up to me, introduced himself, and I was like, it was amazing. It was just an incredible thing. And so then John was the first person to ever hire me to speak for a fee.
Mhm.
From that. So he's like, you have to come to my event next month. I'll pay you this much. And then it just sort of took off from there, like really took off from there. And then Joe invited me back to the next Genius Network after that. And it was similar. I forgot what I gave a talk on that time, but it was a similar thing. And I met all these other people, and I met Tony Robbins, who I ended up doing work with. And all of this was just Joe making these different connections. And it really like completely changed the course of what I ended up doing. And because of that, I got to write so many more books and all this other speaking and then I had my own event in New York like a year later, and all of these amazing people came and spoke at my event because I'd met, including Joe.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it really sort of launched me onto the world stage in a way.
Yeah.
And he's been incredible at every step of everything that I've done since then.
Wow. So all you got this Facebook message from this guy Joe who you had no idea who it was, but there was this tie-in with somebody you did know, David Bach, and all from that one message, him reading your book, it just kind of threw you into this world, this entrepreneurial world where you just got to show up, be yourself, and through that process all these other people were just kind of attracted to you, who you were, how you showed up, the message that were like, man, I think you can help me or help us too, and I'd like to hire you, or I'd like to talk with you about doing something together, or whatever that looked like. and all these other relationships then stemmed from that one with Joe initially reaching out to you. And man,
Yeah.
what a testament to the power of relationships and just showing up and being us, and and you know so okay, so through Joe and going to that one event that he invited, which by the way, it's really, I remember that event. That was the one and only annual event that Joe ever held in California. I was at that event too and stuff, and I had a really similar experience at that event. And it really, that was at a time where I was just really starting to step into doing some of the work that I now get to do today. And it's just, you're so right that these relationships become so valuable to us. And like in your case, it can pretty much launch so much. And so I want to like kind of dig into this just a little bit more. If you look back on that event, that Joe invited you to come speak at that event, which then led to all this other stuff and led to many more relationships. I want you to like just think. I'm sure you could come up with a lot of examples, but I just want to have you just kind of think of one that really stands out for you, where it allowed you to make a really big and substantial impact in the world. And you also know, hands down, that would have never happened if not for your relationship with whoever that was. And I'd like to have you share an experience like that.
And obviously not Joe, somebody else.
Yeah, somebody else. Yeah,
Yeah.
we've done a pretty good job of giving an example of what came from the one relationship with Joe. And so I want to have you give another example.
I mean, I don't think any of this would have been possible without my wife, honestly.
Okay.
I think so. My wife and I went to the same elementary school. She is 2 years younger than me, and her sister was 2 years older than me. So we all went to the same elementary school in New York City, and we sort of knew of each other, but we weren't necessarily friends, but we knew of each other. And then when she was 19, I guess I was 21, a mutual friend reconnected us at a concert, a classical music concert in New York City. And we got together shortly thereafter and have been together for 15 years now. And she's the one who initially pushed me to write my book and to help me sort of turn Less Doing into a real business, because it started as a blog and I was just sort of having fun with it. She's pushed me to do the coaching, to all the speaking, everything. She's really been
Wow.
I'd say the driving force because honestly, like I was successful in real estate before this, and I don't think not to the level that I am now with Less Doing, but we were comfortable, and so I wasn't as driven as I might have been, but she really pushed me to turn this into something much bigger than me. And so it definitely would have happened without her. And the fact that we went to the same elementary school, I think is pretty cool.
That is cool. That is really cool. That is awesome. And I have found the same thing, Ari. You and I are both family guys, with what some might consider large families. And it's so, and what I have found out with a lot of entrepreneurs is that especially us guys, we have a woman behind us who is, I mean, I know my wife Lisa is probably like, your wife is like, so much of what motivates me to do what I do is Lisa and our children. That's a big, huge part of the reason of why I even do what I do, And I just want to be this guy who is a great husband and a great father, and who provides for my family in a way that makes me feel good, but not just be the provider and be this entrepreneur who provides for the family, but then I'm not there for them. I want to be present for them as well and stuff, and be able to, that the business does support that as well and stuff too. And so, I think, I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think a lot of male entrepreneurs will definitely relate to that and stuff. And so,
I have another one for you, which is completely
okay,
unrelated to the business world. So it's in the EMS world. So I have been a member of 7 different ambulance squads over the years, just because we've moved around, and it's sort of a fungible activity in some ways. And during the beginning of the pandemic, we had a house in upstate New York in the Hudson Valley, and because school was shut down and everything, we essentially stayed there. We were living there for almost 2 years, and I joined the rescue squad there. And the chief was an older guy he's probably in his 70s. He's like if you could make a cartoon of a salty old fireman, like, that was this guy.
okay,
But it was during the pandemic, as I said, and it was a small town. So I worked during the pandemic in New York City, which was crazy, and then also worked in a very, very, very rural area, which was like just the opposite end of the spectrum, and weird in a different way. And I just remember, after like almost every call, he would walk up to me and give me a hug and thank me for coming in. And he just had so much knowledge to share about so many things. And really, it was really like a great mentor to me. He's not dead. I don't know what I'm talking about, like he's in the past tense, but I'm not with that squad anymore. But he had a really profound effect on me as well, and made me a better EMT for sure.
wow, very cool. What's his first name, Ari?
Ed.
Ed. Okay, okay, okay. Very cool, very cool. I'll tell you, I love posting this podcast, and I know I shared this with you before we hit the record button, but you know, one of the things that there's 2 sides to this podcast. For the people, for the entrepreneurs that I have the honor of interviewing for this podcast, to be able to give you the opportunity to share your story and your experiences around these relationships, and be able to honor some of the people that have had such a profound impact on your life and on your business. But then also for the listeners, because what's really come from this is so much bigger than I ever imagined. Because we've got a pretty good following on this podcast. We've also been able to interview some pretty amazing entrepreneurs over the last couple of years, and I'm really excited by what we've already accomplished, and I'm even more excited for what we'll continue to do as we keep moving forward with this, because I firmly believe that as entrepreneurs, relationships are the most valuable asset we possess. Everything else stems from that. And and people that are listeners of the podcast who get to hear stuff like this and just hear these real life stories. I mean, Ari, to hear your story of meeting Joe reaching out to you, what transpired. It's like, I mean, people might look at that and go, my gosh, that's unbelievable. How does that even happen? It's because of relationships. But it was like, Joe read your book. He just, through that, was like, man, I like this guy. Somehow or another, him and David talking, and David was like, well, I know Ari and stuff. We can get you guys connected and stuff. And all that came from that, and all that will continue to come, and the impact that is made. I mean, through all of these relationships, Ari, the impact that you've made in the lives that you've impacted has been in the millions. You will never know the true impact of what you've done, but it's been massive. And relationships have played such a huge role in that. And so I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation today. And for anybody listening to this going, man, Kevin, I really love Ari. I love what he stands for. How can they find out more info on what you guys are doing and any resources you can share with them?
Yeah, so I mean, everything I do is at lessdoing.com. They can find out all about me there. I did actually just launch so I had a podcast for 8 years. I did 500 episodes, and I stopped almost 2 years ago, and I just relaunched a new podcast about 3 weeks ago called the Everlasting Business Podcast. So that just hit iTunes and everything like 3 weeks ago. So I'd love for people to check that out. And that's the main places to find me.
Very cool. All right. All right. Well, Ari, any last thing you felt led to share before we call it a wrap?
I don't think so. It's been great.
Very good. Well, Ari, once again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. Really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks so much, Ari.
Thanks a lot.